much to my surprise, I proposed the role, and it got accepted, and I got promoted into it. So now I have sort of the pressure of I now have to do the thing that I defined and said that I was going to do that's new. And yeah, it's kind of weird. Before this, I spent 3.5 years as an adjunct professor of film and communication at Salt Lake Community College. That came out from my master's degree in 2010 was in secondary education, and I couldn't get a job in 2010 as a high school English teacher because there was a glut of teachers on the market at the time. Um, yeah, and so I stayed at home with our kid for about 6 months, and then I got an offer to teach film and did that for 3.5 years, which makes me, of course, an ideal candidate to do software testing as my next sort of career thing. I'm a passionate women's soccer fan. I will talk your ear off about why women's soccer is amazing. If you don't know, the Portland Thorns beat the Utah Royals this last weekend 3-0 at Providence Park, and I'm very happy about that. Sorry, any Royals fans. And as a side note, I am transgender and use she, her pronouns. I bring that up not just because, like, it's an important part of my identity, but I think it's something to think about as testers. We often get into this situation where we're testing things. We have to consider the ramifications of what data is persistent, like what things are immutable and what things are things that change. And it's a careful thing to think about that, like people's identity, things like names, gender, occupations, that sometimes we think that will never change. Like, don't design systems in which you think those things don't change. Like they do for many people, and I happen to be one of those people that it changes for. So the title I came up with was building a low test practice. Before I kind of dive into this, sort of a quick note on format. This is a little bit of a talking. I'm doing more words coming out of my mouth than I feel comfortable with as an educator. Like, part of my spiel as an educator is that the person that does the talking is the person that is doing the learning. And in a more remote centric environment, like, you talks don't work well if, like, in a physical setting, the speaker's trying to say things and then you're giving feedback as the speaker's talking, whereas in a virtual format that actually works really well. So I've got the chat from Slack or from Zoom open, and I'm also in the QA at the point Slack channel in the QA Utah Slack. So as things go along, if you have questions that you think will fit nicely into the flow of things, or I don't explain something in a way that you're understanding, I would prefer that you go ahead and ask that question at that point in either the chat or the Slack, and I will do my best to try to pick that up and pull it in with with the flow. And 3.5 years of teaching practice, I've kind of got a good. I can do that at a pretty good clip. If for whatever reason, like, we can't get to something, or we, like, I don't answer your question to your satisfaction, feel free to, like, call me on it, and we'll have, like, some period at the end for you to ask questions and come up with more thoughts. So in terms of building a low test practice, like, I kind of parse that out into a couple things. One being building. I started this project from scratch. Previous to January of 2020, there was no such thing as a low test system at Lucid. There was no low testing framework that we were using. I had one or two conversations that I will kind of um, talk a little bit about here in a minute, but this is kind of oriented for a situation where you're being asked to create something new. And I think this happens to us a lot as testers. It's like we have this great idea for a new tool or a new, method of testing, and we are kind of tasked with being the first one out there, the first person doing a thing in an organization. So I'm kind of orienting towards that practice, not just in a tools perspective, but also like a interpersonal and organizational perspective. Like, you're starting something new from scratch. There's a lot of stuff that's not the tooling that you have to do to get your organization to decide, yes, this is a good idea for me to be doing. This is something that like I want to see happen in my organization. I use the term load test to describe something where you're exercising a system at a high capacity to find faults. One of the issues that I have at Lucid is that we have a performance team. And in our parlance, performance is a front end concern. Performance is the application in the browser and how well it's doing those things in the browser. I don't care about that. I care about taking the back end, pushing traffic at it at whatever interesting amount, whether that's like at a constant rate so I can see whether there's an increase or a decrease in certain metrics, or at the highest possible rate so I can see what a failure case looks like. But the terminology that I use and that I will continue to use is a load test to encapsulate that sort of idea. And I refer to it as a practice because like this is a thing I'm doing repetitively. It is not the same form now that like I initially intended in January. It's gone through iterations, and not only just like the development of something, but like the continuous doing of something is a practice, and it is both the like doing of the thing and the getting better at the thing. So we divide this story into 5 parts. This is in some ways a like slice of life story that starts for me in January and goes up to the current point. And so I kind of approach it in that way in terms of the structure of the talk. So there's a place where I'm charged with a task. There's a place where I envision a castle in the sky, and instead of doing that, I build a little house. I go through the process of choosing a tool, and then how I went through and sort of implemented the building of a house and that tool together to get something useful, and then how these things like actually became useful. And I have a small bit of bragging at the end where I'll give you sort of a live demo of this whole system in operation. It's kind of my little happy thing that I can show you that like actually works and does something useful and looks cool too on top of all that, which doesn't often happen with performance testing or load testing. So the story starts with Alex being charged with a task. David Torgerson, is our director of DevOps at Lucid. And late 2019, I had sort of a conversation about the future of myself, of backend testing. And in this conversation, we have a pre-production environment. I've given different talks about that before. The short version is we have a pre-production environment is structurally identical to the way we have production, just scaled down smaller. And I was having this sort of career existential crisis because up until this point, I had sort of been the arbiter of pre-production. I had maintained it. I had set up a learning for it. I had taught other people to use it. I had gotten this tool like kind of finely honed and in a good place. And it was a place that we used in a regular cadence to do our production testing. Like we would take things that were going out to production, test them in pre-prod before they went out to production. And we had sort of a once weekly release cadence. On the horizon for us at Lucid was completing continuous deployment. We have some services that were continuously deployed, other services that were not. I knew that continuous deployment, a full continuous deployment, was on the horizon. A pre-production environment would get skipped in our current model, right? So we test code in a test environment that's a smaller environment than pre-production. And then once that code's merged, its next destination is the production system. Pre-prod was not useful. So I was having this crisis with Torgi. And I'm like, so what do we want to do with this? He's like, you know what I think would be cool is let's have a load testing system. Let's have a place that's production-like that we can throw a bunch of traffic at and see what happens and like really investigate issues of capacity and hardening our services. I'm like, that's great. We could do something like record production traffic anonymously and like throw that at the system. He's like, absolutely not. That's not what I want. That's not interesting to me. And the problem with like replicating production traffic, and like one of my first early lessons about load testing is replicating production traffic is not really how you find problems. Um, our production traffic is at a high level a very steady stream, but the things that take production down are sudden, unanticipated things that happen. Unless I can replicate a sudden, unanticipated thing that happens that I wasn't thinking about or that we weren't thinking about as an infrastructure team, replicating production traffic as a load test was not as interesting to us as taking an individual controller. So say in Lucid Chart, we have a controller that generates a new document. Let's take that one specific flow through the system and find out like at what point does that break and in what ways does it break? And can we then take that flow and sort of optimize it for the future? So I got all this together and I had my one-on-one with Katie, who's my manager, and I'm like, so, and I've always like as a tester, my values kind of always felt like it's on the ground floor, right? Like I feel best when I've got a pull request, I've got a really juicy feature, and I'm digging into it, and not being on a Scrum team as a tester scared me to death. Like this was a completely new experience for me. But this seemed like a really interesting project to work on that could have like some massive benefits to the organization. So I went hat in hand to the QA management team and said, I've got this great idea. This is what I want to be doing. This is my vision. Can I get unassigned to a team? Can I just be off by myself and working on this thing? Um, Checked all the boxes, was very clear about what I wanted to do, and that kind of got me taken into a side role to be able to do these sorts of things that I was interested in. Stopping for a brief bit of water. Lots of words. So I envisioned a castle in the sky at the start of this and had to be talked down, ironically, by Craig to build a small house instead. So my initial idea was to build this castle. I don't know if anyone else is familiar with Paul Giuffre's automation stack model. He's given some talks about this at Test Bash San Francisco, and I've seen some videos of it online. He takes sort of an automation system and breaks it down into these disparate chunks. So like you have the tooling, you have an abstraction layer that like is designed so that like if you change your initial tooling, you don't throw all of your tests away. You get to keep the tests and just kind of change the abstraction between the tests and the tooling itself. Um, you then have a bunch of simplified actions that then you compile into a bunch of behaviors, and then you have a script that sort of runs everything. So in my head, I'm like, okay, great. For load testing, what I want is this supervisor thing. So something that can spin up all different kinds of testing, whether it's being done by JMeter, Selenium, whatever the testing tools are relevant. In fact, it would be great if I used multiple different testing tools because I'd be hitting all sorts of different kinds of things. And containers are hot, containers are cool. So let's stick that in a container, which I've never containerized anything before in my life. And so that's a good skill to throw on top of that. Let's build an API abstraction library while we're doing that, because we're going to build this thing, and then like we'll want to be able to have like a framework that we can then change the tools out whenever we want. And then I'm going to build these process functions that go through and are helpers for all these things. And then I'm going to build a script repository that holds all of our testing scripts in one place. And so I took this model to Craig. I don't know if Craig remembers this conversation. I'm like, this is what I want to do. You've got all these things. And he talked me down from it. He's like, look, just build a thing that tests and then iterate on top of that. And it was kind of massive light bulb because like all of the things that we see in product management where it's like you're going to build a new feature. Well, you don't build a wheel and then you put two wheels together and then you put the frame, like this sort of car thing at the top there. You start with a skateboard. You start with like the minimum viable thing that does what you want. And then you iterate and then you make it better and then you make it better. And instead of building this like massive pie in the sky, I mean, if I had built this cathedral of performance testing, it would be massively great. It would take me 2 years, but it would be wonderful and great, and we would have no performance testing for those 2 years. Whereas I found that like if I did something small and then iterated on it and then built something and then built something and built something, I could get something that actually did the things that I wanted. Yeah, prototyping. I could prototype out a few tests, and that's actually what I ended up doing. I prototyped out a few tests, not even on a low test environment on my local box, and then built out like bigger and bigger and bigger until I got like the environment that I wanted. And turns out like for more practical purposes, I don't need a lot of these sort of middle layers. So that's what I did. My MVP was initially, I want a tool. So something that I can easily generate load tests with and use for the load testing process. Let's put it on a server because I don't want it running on my local laptop because putting a whole bunch of production or pre-production traffic from my laptop is probably going to run up my internet bill and make my ops people kind of suspicious and angry. And I want a load testing repository. And by that, like I want a place to put load tests and I want all the benefits that a versioning system gives me. I want things to be in pull requests. I want things to like have a history. And like I found that having those things, like it's just really beneficial to put things into a repository and to treat all of your automation. This was a lesson from Paul Giuseppe. Treat all of your automation as first class code, right? It should be in a pull request. It should be reviewed by somebody that's familiar with what you're doing. Um, so yeah, so that became my sort of MVP. Those are the things that I wanted to do and get done. So then I needed to research what's the best tool for me and for what I was doing. And it really came down to two competitive tools. I wanted something that was easy to use. So I didn't want something that like I needed engineers to go and write things for me. I wanted something that I could hand to another QA person and say, okay, here's some basic ground rules of how to do this. You can build a test on your own. I needed something that was extensible. So I wanted to be able to add plugins and features to it that weren't in sort of the base configuration. Something that's easily configurable that I can just tell, make easy changes to what I'm doing. And this longevity piece, I wanted something that had been around for a while, like something that was kind of long in the tooth and like had a good base of knowledge around. So that's what I wanted. My infrastructure engineers at the time I was trying to make this decision were at AWS reInvent. And while at AWS reInvent, I got two messages from developers, one discussion in stand up, and then a series of sales calls from Gatling because they saw this shiny new tool at the AWS reInvent and they're like, yeah, this sounds great. Their arguments were it's in a common language with the rest of the code base. So we use Scala for our backend services. With Gatling, you write your load tests in Scala. There is a GUI, but like on the like actual code we're submitting, it's in Scala. It's performant. Like compared to JMeter, Gatling is highly performant. It's more powerful in that way. It's easily abstractable. Like the abstraction layer is a lot easier to deal with because you're dealing with Scala and a real code. Scalability, like you can scale it up really easily. And Again, shiny new thing that they saw at AWS. Ultimately, the decision is left up to me. So which thing do I want? The thing that I can hand out to a bunch of QA folks, or the thing that the engineers are really excited about that is extremely powerful and efficient? Spoiler alert, I chose JMeter. None of the issues of scalability have become an issue for me when using JMeter. On a single, our JMeter instance runs on a single AWS M5 large, which is a relatively inexpensive instance in AWS. I can produce enough traffic from that box to take pre-production down. Like I can, upon my command, I can explode pre-production pretty easily with our load tests by scaling it up to 300 threads. I don't have to have this massive multi-serve tenant system in order to do that. So for that and all sorts of other reasons, I chose JMeter. A big caveat, it's contextual, like a lot of things around testing. JMeter was the right choice for me and the right choice for handing it off to QA members at my team. It may not be the right choice for you. I'm trying to say that I have no bias against Gatling. It was just not the right thing for us at the time. So got a choice of tool, got an idea of the things that I need for like a minimal viable load test system. We got to build this thing, right? So lots of moving parts. First thing, I need some infrastructure. I need a server to um, stand this thing up on, right? So hat in hand, I go to my infrastructure team. Please give me a server for this, right? We use Chef at Lucid for infrastructure management. So there was a bunch of Chef pieces. I need to install JMeter, sync the repository onto the box, write some little glue scripts for actually running things, figure out how I was going to deal with plugins. And we wanted this sort of daily regression performance run so that I knew like we had a baseline of what our performance looked like. Need to set up this load testing repository. Monitoring and alerting was also a piece, but it's a free piece because our pre-production system already had alerting and monitoring for our regular regression tests. I could just piggyback off of that, and it was pretty simple. So infrastructure. Went heart in hand to them and said, please, sir, may I have a little server? And they said, sure, you can have this M5 large. To do that, I had to write a role in Chef. I had to write an infrastructure pull request, which I basically copied our deploy box and put that in a pull request and then got told that was completely wrong, rejected, and then told what was right. So lesson there, like sometimes you can ask and ask and ask, but then if you do the wrong thing, you get told like how to do it right. I had to work with the infrastructure engineer a little bit to get Chef to first boot. We have this process where Chef has to kind of bootstrap before it becomes a persistent environment. But now I've got this single box that runs load tests all the time. And because like the way we set up uses Chef, it's completely ephemeral. If you decide you want 5 of these, we stand up 5 of these, and as soon as Chef runs, all the tools I need for running load tests immediately exist, including all the tests to run. Like they just sit on the box ready to go, which is incredibly powerful. And I highly recommend, like, if you're going to create any sort of environment for running load tests, like using the infrastructure management tools that you likely have from your infrastructure team makes your life so much easier. So some things in Chef that I had to do, one of them was install JMeter. So I had to write some Chef logic that goes out to the Apache website if JMeter isn't installed, grabs JMeter and installs it. I need to sync my repository. So I have this script that runs every 15 minutes, checks if there are changes to the load test repository, and then pulls the current version onto the box. Luckily, our business intelligence team does the same thing with Airflow that they use for jobs. And so I was able to just steal their logic, which is always, of course, a great programming trick, right? If you've got a team that's doing something like what you're doing and you can grab it, like completely steal from them. That's like at the heart of software development. Glue scripts. So I had to write a script because JMeter's command line
Oh,
arcanus is it's just arcane. Like trying to tell JMeter to do something dash n threads this dash j that, like I had a hard time. I didn't want to have to pull up a JMeter cheat sheet every time I wanted to run a load test. So I created this glue script that gave me some additional flexibility. JMeter doesn't let you specify a runtime by default. So I've got it wrapped in a way that like it runs the test for a certain amount of time, stops. I don't have to think about it. And it's the same command structure every time. There's also a little bit in the glue scripts where the glue script knows where the load test repository lives. I don't ever have to think about that. I can just tell it the location of test. It'll check local first, like the directory it's running from first, and then it'll check the load test repository to see if it's there before it fails, which is kind of cool. Um, I had to write some chef code that handles plugins because one of our tests for our event service that I'll demo a little later on did WebSockets, and JMeter doesn't do WebSockets by default. And then I wanted this thing where we ran a daily regression run. So every night from 7 to 9 p.m., the load test environment runs a script. It goes out, it runs a series of load tests in a specific order. It creates this like very nice looking graph that tries to stay the same every time it runs. The logic for that, I just outright stole from the release train. We have a continuous deployment release train. It runs every 15 minutes. It deploys code to various places. I took sort of that logic and just modified it for my needs. One of the biggest benefits of doing things with an infrastructure management tool like Chef is that a lot of things that are somewhat difficult become incredibly easy. This is the pull request to upgrade JMeter. It's one line. I put in a version number, I get the newest version of JMeter. I don't have to go out, get it, figure out where it is, think about how to install it. It's all there and it's all ephemeral. So highly recommended to do things in that way. So then I have this thing that's a load testing repository, a home for our load testing code. One of the problems that I ran into very early on while trying to prototype stuff out is that JMX files are not very intuitive. So this is sort of the native format of a load tested JMeter. It's a bunch of XML, and it doesn't make a lot of sense if you're kind of staring at this without context. And particularly for a developer or somebody that's not familiar with our load testing environment, like wading through this is painful. So one of the things that I established early on is that for every load test in our repository, we set up documentation. And in each pull request, every load test must come with documentation that explains in plain text. And let me zoom in a little bit so you can kind of read through this. This is a plain text document that says, okay, this is the name of the test. This is what the test is designed to do. This is each individual component of the test as it's labeled in the JMX file, and it tells you exactly what that piece does in plain English, so that if anybody ever wants to change it or try to understand it, I'm not relying on them looking at this arcane JMX file. I have something in a very clear, plain English format that I can then point them to and say, this is exactly what this test does, step by step. And because I do it in every pull request, I never have to think about going back and documenting stuff after the fact. It always exists there. I also have this comma separated value file called regression.csv. So that nightly regression file, or that, sorry, nightly regression run is dictated by this file, regression.csv. It looks for it in the load test directory, which is generated from the repository. And in this file, I specify each test that I want run as part of the regression and the amount of time that it runs. So if I ever add new tests or I want to change tests, It's a pull request to the load test repository, and as soon as that pull request is merged, that becomes a new part of the regression cycle. One thing that I've added recently is this file can now support number of threads. So if you put like a comma 100 after this, this test will run for 10 minutes and then have whatever number of threads here. The code is also smart enough, if that's been omitted, to just run with the default number of threads. Cool. So back to this piece of monitoring and alerting, because I already have production-like alerting in pre-prod, but there's some things that I can do to make this a little bit better. I have some simplistic anomaly detection. It's very simple, and I'm not entirely happy with it, if I'm honest, but it's something that lets me very quickly know in a load test run that something is very wrong. So each of these alerts only alerts during the time that the load tests are running. So if you notice, like right here, all these alerts are currently muted. Zoom in a little bit so you can see easier. Yep, so if I hover this, these are all muted. Load tests run in an hour and 14 minutes from now. These will all become active, and the alerts for this all pipe only to Slack, to the load testing channel in Slack. So when the load test runs and there's an anomaly, these will alert in Slack. And the query for the anomaly is really simple. Take the timing of the service, so the response times from that service, subtract them from yesterday's response times, and see if they're over a certain threshold. So if you look here, I have sort of a warning limit and an alert limit. And if at any point we're doing worse during our load test than we were the day before, we will spawn an alert. It's a quick and dirty way to see, okay, there's some sort of performance thing going on here that's not what we expected. There's some problems with it. The biggest being that our pre-production system is not hermetic. There's people testing different things on it all the time. We have jobs that run all the time. But it at least gives me a sense of, hey, if we've suddenly deployed the document service and that night the document service has these large errors, the next morning I can look at that graph and go, yeah, I'm going to go investigate that and see what's new about document service, and are there any like changes in controllers that like might account for this sort of situation. So that's a lot of like nuts and bolts of how to build a thing, how to convince people that this is a good idea, how to like get all this stuff together. But then like you got to use it for stuff, right? So one of the things that we've been working on at Lucid is improving our collaboration. And part of our collaboration is a service that we refer to as the event service. The event service is responsible for getting events out quickly to the clients. Previously, it was a custom-built service. We're now using Redis for that. So I have this test that I can run, and it's something that I ran during the development of the new event service so that I could show, so that we could like actually benchmark it and prove out that like, and kind of iron down some performance issues, because I can actually like run this test, look at the traffic coming from the event service and see what exactly is like causing performance to degrade. So this test goes to the event service. It has a counter for users, so it runs through a series of users. It opens a WebSocket connection, and it sends some raw events through that event socket connection. It runs for 15 iterations, and it moves a cursor. So what I'm going to do, and of course this is a live demo, so I apologize in advance because things eventually will go wrong, as always does. So I'm on the load test box right now. This is the load test wrapper script that I had mentioned before. Sorry, let me go back to that. Here's the load test wrapper script, Lucid load test. We're going to run it for 2 minutes. We're going to run the file called cursors.jmx. And I don't know if I want to be terribly evil, but let's give it 100 threads. So this represents 100 persistent threads that are constantly sending event information into our event service, right? And sending cursor information. So I'll hit enter. We'll get an error message about not being able to set logs because the log file is owned by the regression and not by this. It's fine. We're going to start this test. This is JMeter sort of warming up. Also don't know how well this will go over on Zoom because it's for kind of cool. Okay, we're starting up the load test. We're spinning up. We've got 81 events per second going through. Oh, and hey, look at that. What you're seeing is a series of cursor events from those 100 threads as they cascade down the canvas. We're just running them in a diagonal line and they're all, moving at the same time. I can actually go on to a user on that account and see that. The other thing that I can do is I can go into Datadog, assuming that Datadog is up. And here's the really interesting things. I can see what that traffic looks like. So in our event service, I can see, okay, here's the number of queued tasks that it's trying to process. Here's the rate at which it's processing messages. Here's the number of TCP/IP connections that are generated. Here's like the different messages that are going through. Here's what system memory looks like. I'm spiking on system memory, watch out. Number of sort of active threads in Redis, connection pull for Redis and what it's doing. Any delays that Redis is currently seeing, that's starting to go up. The number of buckets that Redis is currently processing, there's 9 of them. Thread weights, so how long is it taking for Redis to process any of the actual threads. And yeah, so I can actually see what's going on real time in the event service while I'm throwing a bunch of traffic at it and actually like seeing the results in the browser. This is like one of my favorite load tests that we've written so far. Cool. So that's like a practical thing that we've been able to do with it because we ran this set of tests against our existing event service. It found that like at 40 threads, we could easily cause the event service to fail in pre-prod. And then at the new version of the event service, we can get to like about 120. And to be clear, like that's not even representative of users, right? Because a user wouldn't send all that traffic in a short amount of time. So this is 120 constantly active users doing something against the event service at a given time. This is one that I don't exactly have a demo for, but it's one that like is a case that's more recent that we did. We used the load testing system to validate a sort of dangerous change. Our user service database is in Aurora, and AWS Aurora allows you to have separate reader and writer nodes. So you can have a database node that reads the database, in fact, multiple reader nodes, and then you can have a node that's a writer. Our previous implementation was to have the reader and the writer on the same node at the same time. So we wanted to test out what would happen in production if we went from a reader-writer to a reader and then demoted the reader-writer node to just being a writer. Making database changes in your production system, if you've ever gone through that process, is something that makes your nails become shorter because you're constantly biting them as you're going through it. Like databases are things that like the higher ups don't ever want to hear that you're doing terrible amounts of tinkering with because that's your user data, right? Like your bread and butter. So being able to ensure that the changes that you make to your database structures are safe is incredibly valuable to the business. So what we were able to do in pre-production is put the system under a load. So what I did is I ran my series of user service tests. There's one that creates new users. There's one that's constantly getting the list of users, and run those at capacity, and then have the infrastructure engineers do the proposed changes. And what happened was we went through that process, like I put it under load, and they went to change over the reader writer to be a reader writer and a reader, and our error rates skyrocketed. So we stopped what we were doing, we figured out what was going on. And so like we were actually able to make a productive change to our infrastructure under more realistic situations, under like a useful amount of load. Whereas if you just made the changes with it without it being under load, there's no like active traffic to give you error rates. So you would previously you would test something like that and be like, and we've had several of these changes where it's like, oh, that went great in pre-prod. Let's do it in production. And then you go to do it in production, production goes down. So being able to give your infrastructure engineers sort of a confidence in, I'm going to make this change. Here's exactly what the impact to our users will look like. And here's exactly like what that looks like under enough load to matter. It's hugely useful and impactful. Cool. So that's what I've got for you today. Open it up to more questions if you have any.
So when it was you that was working on this, did you eventually make a team and train your team, or how? Kind of explain to me how you scaled this.
I would like a team.
Okay, so you don't have a team
Hint,
now.
hint, Craig. No, it's to the up to this point, it's been me and like part-time one or two other people that have kind of pulled into my fold and been like, okay, here's what I'm doing. Can you like, here's learning the ropes, and then have you write like, I have one QA person that's written a bunch of tests for all of our import endpoints. So we now have a bunch of regression tests that check the performance of all of our import endpoints on a regular basis. My goal is, yes, I would like to teach more people, and it's one of those things where like there are politics in large organizations because it's the nature of being a large organization. Um, Part of having something like this is constantly proving its worth, right? And so if I can go through that cycle of doing the more that I test that it's worth, the more I can go to people and say, hey, this has been valuable in the past. Now can I get more resources to make it even better and sort of increase that vision? There's a question in the chat that's like, it's interesting to build something like that. Excuse me, I have limited knowledge about JMeter. Is it for web testing only? Yes. JMeter is a tool that's designed to essentially send raw TCP/IP traffic to a given server. Its big value is in that, and some of its limitations are in that too. Like I can't do a lot. I can do a lot of testing of the back end with this, where I know the destination of things and how to send it. I don't have the ability to use this to do load testing from things in the application very easily. Event being an exception because the way that we send events, it's terrible. The way that we send the information from the event service is human readable and very easy to understand. It's like, here's the location of the cursor, X and Y, and it's in plain text. And I can just send that event over and over, and that kind of is enough to both perform the action and kind of light up our system in that way. Have I looked at ready-made tools from various companies? Yes. And whenever I look at a ready-made tool like that, there's two sort of costs that I have to consider. One of them is like I have to go to somebody with budget purse strings and say, hey, I want to buy this thing, right? And for some reason I have a real hard time, and maybe this is just a personal fault of mine. I have a hard time doing that when I can build it myself. I'm also the kind of person that's like, if I can build any sort of structure, even outside of testing at home, If I could build a bookcase from IKEA, I'm going to do that over like buying an expensive bookcase that's pre-made. Um, the other piece of that is that I recognized early on that in performing this kind of testing, in like figuring out how to do this, there was an amount of infrastructure knowledge that I was gaining. So for me to go and say, okay, I need to figure out how to create a bunch of users, like I've got to go find the endpoint that the user service that we hit in our user service. I've got to see what the traffic looks like when I do that manually, capture that, kind of interpret it. And I feel like doing it myself and building it myself, I mean, I have a better understanding of Chef. I can write I can write some amount of Ruby now that I couldn't really do before this. Like my Ruby knowledge has been increased by like actually putting it into a meaningful task. Um, Not only is my Chef knowledge better, but I'm now writing Chef pull requests for non-performance testing things and reviewing, like being primary reviewer on infrastructure pull requests. So like, and those are things that like, yeah, a ready-made tool probably would have saved me time in the long run, but there's a lot of ancillary things that I learned by going through this process that were really valuable.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
When it comes to your tests, it seems like you're testing like individual API endpoints. You're just
Hmm.
like slamming individual ones with just massive amounts of stuff.
Hmm.
So are these also like post requests and stuff like that? So you're hitting the database as well?
With the exception of the event service ones, yeah, these are generally speaking posts. So I'm saying, here's what the API call should look like, and I send that as a post request to the relevant service.
Cool.
Um, and to address Daniel's question in the chat, um, yes, I can do. Not only can I do all this in Postman, but I can take Postman tests and import them into JMeter and create load tests in JMeter from Postman tests.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and this is like scratching the surface of like what JMeter can do. I'm kind of aware of like how I'm using it for various purposes, and like the things that you can do with JMeter are far beyond the things that I'm doing right now. But I need to get sort of the basics down first. Cody asks about Gatling, and in the beginning they wanted me to go with Gatling, and what do the engineers think about JMeter now? Um, they're impressed, to be honest. Like in working with the event service, what actually happened was I had built the event service test, knowing that we were making changes to the event service, and then after the fact, the engineers came to me and said, "Hey, I hear you have this load testing system. Can you like we're working on the event service. Can you do something to put the event service under load?" I'm like, "Give me a minute." And right then and there, pulled up the load test for the event service and started to put the system under load. And they're like, "Whoa, okay." So yeah, they've been able to see and like being able to shake down a lot of those issues that we had with the event service, because there were a few bugs that we kind of had to figure out under load, and like increase performance, because we ran into some problems where one service was calling another service when it shouldn't have been. Um, it's Yeah, we were able to very quickly sort of iterate on that and make that work better.
Yeah, Alex,
I have one. Oh,
go for it. You go first. You
okay.
first.
I guess kind of some of my personal questions, kind of curious. I know in the beginning you said you approached management and said, "Hey, can I get off a Scrum team and go do my own project?" I'm just wondering, are you still doing your own project, or did you get kind of roped into doing everything else as well?
Um, it's an interesting question, because like even when I was on a Scrum team, I always had like a handful of other things that I kind of kept on a boil. And now I'm doing this, and I have a handful of other things that I'm keeping on a boil. So the answer is I'm not technically on a Scrum team, but I haven't washed my hands of manual testing either. It just, I still jump in on stuff. I still help out with major projects. And to some degree, I'm even more beholden to the infrastructure teams for their needs than I was as a manual tester. There was another question, I believe.
I had one for you, Alex.
Yeah.
So I guess to kind of piggyback off that one, because we talked about how like you're not doing manual testing anymore, and yet at the same time, it sounds like you're doing lots of human centric level stuff where you're exploring, creating hypotheses, generating questions, and then answering these things with your experiments of load and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So do you feel like you're still using some of the skills and activities maybe that you're doing before now, just kind of against it in a different way?
Yeah, every day. And I think there's also like part of my effectiveness in this role is that I've been in the product for so long. It's actually like sort of fundamentally one of the values I think that quality assurance professionals bring to infrastructure teams in particular, like your ops team or your on-call team or your SRE team, is that they tend to be so back-end focused that they're very out of touch with the product. Like they know that like the document service does a thing, it stores a document or it makes a certain kind of change. How to get to that change in the product is not a thing that they're going to understand very quickly. So there's a lot of value in being as a tester that you can bring to infrastructure teams to be like, even with live site incidents, you can be like, okay, I've got, this problem that's going on in production. We have no idea how to trigger it. The mindset of a tester where it's like, I'm going to try this thing, I'm going to try this other thing, to see what and kind of suss out in that very like detective sort of way is a mindset that developers don't tend to have, and it's incredibly valuable to those teams.
I have a question. This is Leo.
Mhm.
How do you determine like how many requests do you need to send per second or per minute when you run your tests?
There are
How do you scale it if it's too many? Like if you need to send, let's say, thousands of requests or million requests, there's no way you can produce that many requests with one machine, right? Like your
right.
laptop. I tried JMeter with my laptop. Like I was only used like 300 threads, and after that it was failing. It wasn't really producing good results.
I'm so there's a couple of different aspects to your question. Um, for what it's worth, putting it in AWS simplifies a lot of the networking, and it's in the same VPC as the rest of the pre-production system. So it doesn't have a long way to travel. It's in the same network as everything else. So like a lot of my network lag and mitigation issues don't exist just because the server that I'm using exists in the place that I'm testing. So that's one piece of it. I've never needed to run much more than 150 threads because there's two pieces to that. One is what's the worst case scenario for what users would actually do, right? It's unlikely that I would have, knowing my production system, and this is like, I have to have context from my infrastructure engineers, I have context from like looking at monitoring of production. I don't have cases where there's 150 users actively hammering on the event service over a period of time in my infrastructure. That's just not a thing that I have that happens. So one piece of it is knowing what's actually going on in production and what that scale looks like, right? Like, am I getting 200 of this kind of request in production? Then I should be able to handle 200 of this kind of request in pre-production. The other piece of it is just sort of experimentation. Like I've control of the signal going in and I can see the results of what's happening in the signal going out. There's an element of exploratory testing where I'm like, okay, what does 85 threads look like? Does it fail over in 10 minutes? Does it stay up? Does it like, is there there are some situations where like I ran a load test, the immediate response wasn't anything, but the service garbage collected a whole bunch afterwards and then fell down. it's all context, like knowing what your production system does and knowing like and playing around with it, seeing, you know, what are the limits.
Thank you.
I've got another question. This could be for Alex or Craig. So, what keeps the system around? Have you found a way to be able to measure the like a proactive, just basically, hey, this system's helped us mitigate bugs, or we anticipate this would have happened? Can you speak to me how this is viewed from like an executive standpoint?
I think the answer to that is that load testing is a thing that we have talked about for probably 8 years, like from the perspective of, yeah, we should really do that, you know, one of these days. And so it's proving itself increasingly useful every time, you know, Alex is able to help a developer verify that a change they made isn't going to suddenly, you know, kill production, right? And so, to be honest, it's kind of a hard question to answer because we've had no pushback on it at all. You know, but building this out and having Alex dedicate time to doing this and build this, and now growing the team that Alex uses to help do this stuff, like that's all thumbs up from my perspective, and from what I'm hearing from, you know, my boss and on up. So it's pretty self-evident when we're able to show, like, to give the developers confidence that what they're building is going to work when it hits production.
Cool. Thank you.
Well, if there are no more questions now, I'm on the QA Utah Slack. You can reach me there. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter at Langshall. Feel free to reach out if you think of something later or you just want to chat. Like, always free to do that.
Alex, thank you so much. That was an awesome presentation, and the demo was insane. The live demo that not just worked, but like it was just very easy to follow, and it looked cool, and there was pretty colors. Like,
I've never had a live demo of anything. I got to knock on wood for that because I've never had a live demo of anything go that smoothly in my life. So
I know exactly what you're talking about. So like when I'm like, oh please, and it went through, I was like, yes. Even I was cheering for you, like silently over here. But that was awesome. So thank you so much. Hopefully this was valuable for y'all, because it definitely was for me. And I know that some people that are on my team that are here probably saw like, okay, this is like, we're moving towards things like this, and now seeing an actual like tangible implementation of it, and its success and the visualization of it, and it just super valuable. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining. I will post this recording into the QA at the Point channel as soon as I can, and then I'll edit it and throw up on my YouTube channel, Kidman Media Group, on the Tubes of You. All right, thanks everyone. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you, Alex.
thank you all.